Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Bloomberg. For people who don't know me, I'm Chris Lowe, the TMT Specialist here. We are very pleased to obviously be working with the London Futurists this afternoon for what looks to be a fascinating session. So, first of all, I'd like to thank David for pulling together what a great afternoon we have ahead of us. So I believe we're going to have a series of about 4 or 5 panels over the 4 panels over the course of the afternoon. We do want people to interact and obviously ask as many questions as you like. And then also I do believe there is a hashtag which is London Futurists. So please tweet and pardon? LONFUT. Okay, there you go. LONFUT. So please tweet away and tell the world about the wonderful things you're hearing this afternoon. So without further ado, I think I'm going to hand over to David and welcome again and speak to you all later. Thank you. Thanks, David.
Many thanks, Chris. So indeed, thanks to Bloomberg for organising this event and providing this magnificent facilities. My name's David Wood, I chair London Futurists. In the course of this opening session, the next 25 minutes or so, I want to do a few things. I want to say a bit about what futurism is and what it isn't. You may be skeptical about the whole discipline. I want to try and explain to you why I think all organisations should have futurist sections, and indeed why all of us should become more disciplined and more systematic in our thinking about the future. I'm going to talk about the Millennium Project, which is one particular futurist organisation which has been around for nearly 20 years. I'm going to share some of their thinking about what's likely to be ahead and also about what some of the biggest challenges will be in the course of the next 10 years or so. Along the way, I'm going to highlight some areas where there may be business opportunities. So we did not prepare this thinking, hey, there's a bunch of investors, what should we tell them in terms of the areas that should be invested in? But it is true that some of the areas which are going to become more significant over the course of the next 10 years may also be areas in which there is significant business opportunities. And then last in what I say, I'm going to come back to one point which has emerged from the work of the Millennium Project, one area which the Millennium Project, I think, with some justification, sees as the most deserving of further thought and further investigation. It's an area which is going to have very major repercussions over the 10, 20 years ahead or so, but which so far has not been addressed carefully enough. So if you're being bored by anything I say in the next few minutes, you might wonder ahead what that topic will be. So let's start with futurism. And when this word comes to your mind, some of you may think in terms of, oh, it's a bit like astrology, you know, you look vaguely at the stars and you might predict what might be ahead. You might think in terms of alchemy, some wishful thinking, some naive hopes in terms of changing things which cannot actually be changed. I would put something called futurology in that same camp. And I'm going to argue that futurism is emerging from that kind of wishful thinking in the same way that astronomy has emerged from astrology, in the same way that chemistry has emerged from alchemy. There are all disciplines which have got lots of data, which form hypotheses, in which there is criticism of hypotheses by a community of people who reflect on each other's scenarios and to look for evidence that various scenarios are becoming more important or less important. So I'm going to talk indeed about one particular community of futurists, but each of the speakers who are ahead this afternoon will also be representative of one or other futurist communities. And in each of these communities, we try and do the same thing that has been responsible for the remarkable acceleration in technology over history, and which is accelerating even more recently, which is we're seeking to build positive feedback cycle in which there are more and more people networked together who are including engineers, entrepreneurs, scientists. We have more people like that educated around the world to higher levels in terms of technology, in terms of entrepreneurial skills, in terms of science. There are more and more people around the world with these attributes who are creating lots of building blocks which others can then combine into products. They're also finding better ways to collaborate, online systems, such that there's less of a barrier of entry for people to come into this virtuous cycle. And by the way, some of the outputs in terms of new technology are technologies for improved education, whether it's wikis, massive online open courses, open sources, and whatever. So the whole cycle accelerates. So we have unprecedented numbers of people who are contributing to new technology. That is why technology is accelerating. But we, in the futurist community, want to do the same thing with more and more people picking up the skills of futurism, connecting to various online communities, and generating not just technology, but a better understanding of future scenarios, a better understanding of which scenarios are credible and which are incredible, which are science fact as opposed to Hollywood science fiction, and also, by the way, which of these scenarios are actually truly desirable rather than just initially appealing, cool and exciting, but when you think more carefully about it, turn out to have very bad consequences. And vice versa. Some of the scenarios which initially people say, oh, yuck, I wouldn't like that, but then you think about it, actually, it would be a better world. So that's the community which is emerging around the world, various futurist communities. And one of them, as I said, is the Millennium Project, which has been around for almost 20 years. And most of the slides I'm going to share in the next 20 minutes actually come from the Millennium Project. It has 56 nodes around the world, some of which are larger, some are smaller. There are some here in London. I've seen a few people in the audience who have been part of the London node. And the idea is to, as I said, share insights around the world so that the understanding gets better. This was initially funded by the United Nations University around 20 years ago and is now self-funded. And every year it creates an update called the State of the Future. It is now in its 18th edition, and every year, in a sense, it gets better because it benefits from criticism from people who have read the previous version. There's a whole bunch of commendations which are too small for you to read. If you look afterwards at millennium-project.org or indeed stateofthefuture.org, you will find more details of what people have said about this. And one of the main outputs every year is something called the State of the Future Index, which is a way of distilling from that very large number of future-relevant facts and information, which is contained in the report, a summary. Is the future getting better, or is the future getting worse? It's where you look at a whole number of variables. There are actually 28 used, which includes lots of economic variables, such as the gross national income per capita, index of inequality, index of unemployment, various other things such as population growth, mortality rate, school enrollment, terrorism incidents, and so on. And people in this community have been arguing and debating over the right measures as to whether the world is, on the whole, getting better or getting worse. And I have to say, then you put all these together year by year. What's done is the figures are analyzed for the past and for the present, but also for what people think they're going to be in 10 years' time. And this results in this graph here, which has been scaled back, and so the last year is rated at 1. So this does show, on the whole, that the situation is getting better. It does show, by and large, that the world is improving, and as the State of the Future book says, the world is improving better than most pessimists know. There's a but, and we're going to come back to the but shortly, but if you look at these various indexes, it is true that worldwide people are becoming healthier, wealthier, better educated, more peaceful, more connected, living longer. Indices such as child mortality has dropped very significantly since 1990, 50%. It used to be the case that half of the developing world was in extreme poverty. It's now down to 17%. Connected via the internet. And this is remarkable, I find, that the life expectancy for the whole world is now 70.5 years, not just in the so-called developed world. And despite there being lots of conflict, at least in one measure, the number of international wars has continued to fall. So as I said, every year the team around the world looks at this and adjusts their figures. And of the 28 variables, 18 of them are showing some measures of progress. For example, there's much more electricity being generated from renewables, you can see, and that's projected to continue. There is a reduction in poverty. There is a slowdown in population growth. So in 18 of the 28 measures, there's grounds for optimism. But in 10 of the measures, things are worrying, either because they're not getting better at all or because they're getting significantly worse. Unemployment is growing. The amount of carbon emissions from fossil fuels and cement production is growing significantly. Terrorism is growing hugely, and so forth. So if we pull all that together, going back to this phrase, the world is improving better than most pessimists know, but the future dangers are in many ways worse than most optimists indicate. And that's what most of my presentation from now on is going to be about. Not just about what is going well, of which there is plenty, but some of the future dangers that lie ahead, and which futurists are trying to map out and understand in more detail, and which, if we get things right, we'll find solutions which will include government action, but will also include business action. As I mentioned, there is the risk that advanced technology is going to lead to longer-term structural unemployment. There is the risk that the wonderful technology, which has been created via Moore's Law, will lead to increasingly destructive weapons, which more and more people will get their hands on, so-called hate groups, which could lead to sometimes known as Moore's outlaws. So Moore's Law gives rise to Moore's outlaws. And this isn't just groups of people, increasingly individuals, so-called lone wolves, could make and deploy weapons of mass destruction. And that's something that the Millennium Project has looked at hard. Then, of course, there is the risk of global warming. Difficult to be sure exactly what pace that's going to proceed at, but there are signs that the early signs of global warming will generate more disruption, they'll generate more migration. Arguably, one of the causes of the horrendous situation in Syria is a drought that might be traced in part to global warming. And so there is the risks of yet more social violence. Then there's another bunch of people who can use this powerful technology for ill. Very large set, sometimes known as Crime Inc., which has more than twice the budget of all the militaries of all the countries added together. So there's a lot going on there which most people don't pay a lot of attention to. Understandably, there aren't too many people who are doing detailed studies of that. It can be quite dangerous, but it's certainly the case. Then there's the risk that more and more countries will end up, as is described here, and I apologize for the Central American states which are in good situation, but there is the risk that democracy will disappear. There's a whole bunch of other things, like cities might become too complex to manage. There is the risk that in trying to fix global warming with geoengineering, so nanotech systems that extract carbon from the air, that might have unintended consequences. And I'll just briefly mention at this point that one of the forthcoming London Futurist events, which will be taking place in December in UCL, will feature a focus on that particular area. There are other things that new technology might get wrong, nanotech, nuclear weaponry, artificial general intelligence, and there are older worries about asteroids hitting the Earth and magnetic poles possibly switching around. It is important to study all these things dispassionately and to try and figure out which of them are more serious, which of them deserve more attention than they're getting already. And I'll come back to that at the end. The Millennium Project also looks at what was initially called global risks, global issues. It's now formulated as global challenges, things that probably aren't getting enough attention worldwide, but which are very interconnected, so it's hard to study one without the other. But they include many things that you might expect to be on the list, as well as possibly some surprises. So, how can we indeed continue the development which has been so important in bringing people out of poverty without causing climate issues? That is very well discussed, so I'm not going to say more about that. But there are other issues which have got less attention, such as the shortage of clean water, which in some parts of the world is likely to generate conflict. How do we balance population growth with the resources? I'm not afraid myself about population growth, but I am afraid in the transitionary issues in which there may not be sufficient resources ready. Then there's the question of how do we get from the authoritarian regimes, which are in many parts of the world, and how do we migrate them so that democracy emerges? And this has worked in a few cases, and we should be glad, but in many other places it hasn't worked well at all. There's a topic which one of the future speakers this afternoon is going to cover, Anders Sandberg, who is looking at decision-making. Problem is, the decision-making is getting more and more complicated because of these issues, because of the acceleration of technology, because of the overlapping, complicated nature of many of these risks. So how can we actually take advantage of better global foresight to take better decisions? I won't run through all of these because I'm going to try and abstract a certain level, but there is a lot of important issues here, whether it's crime, whether it's harnessing science more quickly to improve the human condition, and whether it's putting ethics more fully into the global decision making. Each of these issues is discussed in some length in the State of the Future book. Each of them deserves indeed a lot of attention. But the Millennium Project has been thinking hard about these issues for a while. We're trying to find some points of leverage, some things that if done right would actually address several of these issues at the same time. And this is where there may indeed be opportunities for business investments. So this has resulted in this integrated global strategy. And again, I'm not going to look at all of it, but I will point to some areas in which it may be very important that we apply technology in smart ways. And if you look at the blue circles, they're issues, they are projects that could be run, which, if successful, would address, in their own way, each address 4, 5, 6, or 7 of these issues from the previous slides. So if we look at the top, saltwater agriculture, I think the opportunity to grow food in the sea rather than growing it in fresh water will straight away get round some of the risks of not having enough fresh water, not having enough rain. Will also possibly mitigate some of the risks of climate change. The one next to it, meat without animals. This has been discussed for a long time. So far, the kind of synthetic meat that's created is, first of all, very expensive, and secondly, not very tasty. But you know, if that investment continues, then it may well be that wide numbers of people will change over to becoming, preferring that kind of meat. And that will avoid some of the issues with climate change, because agriculture, as it's presently practiced, is one of the contributors to greenhouse gases, a significant contributor. It will also free up land for lots of other issues. Let's go the other way around the chart. Increase individual intelligence. If we have better use of smart drugs, if we have people who are better educated, but also people who are able to think more clearly, benefiting not just from education, but from being more in control of their own brains, then again, it might have an effect on many of these issues. Some of the other stuff you won't be surprised to see there, like the green investment in renewable energy, something that does, thankfully, already have a lot of attention. But I want to move from here. I want to move from here to the issue which, over the course of the last few years, the Millennium Project has identified as possibly the single one which hasn't yet got enough global attention and which has very wide repercussions. They've called it the inevitability of a new economics. And they point out, as many other people have pointed out, that there are various economic developments which should give us all some worries. As Thomas Piketty recently said, the French writer, concentration of wealth is increasing and income gaps are widening. So at the same time as many societies are overall becoming wealthier, the medium income, that's the income of the person who is in the middle of the whole distribution, has not gone up, especially in America, some parts of Europe, for quite a long time. We are seeing economic growth, but in many cases it seems to be economic growth that doesn't require a whole lot of new employment. It's economic growth which is benefiting from technology. But the investment in capital and technology is one that's having more significance than investing in lots of people. So yes, there are people who can get new jobs, but there are fewer people getting jobs than before. And some of the most successful companies with huge revenues, such as Google or other things like Instagram, they have got there with many fewer people per amount of revenue than historically in grand companies such as General Motors or Kodak. And this is leading to the risk, which I mentioned earlier, that we're going to see more and more people unemployed. And there are forecasts by a whole lot of people that we might see anywhere between 25% to 50% unemployment. And in this analysis, what's happening in the south of Spain just now, what's happening in other parts of Europe, in which there's large amounts of youth unemployment, this isn't just a local accident, it's part of a bigger trend in which as technology becomes more powerful and allows people to generate very significant wealth, it also diminishes the need to hire so many people. If so, then people talk about a new economics in which perhaps we need to restructure how we look after people who don't have a job. And this is sometimes called a guaranteed income. So this was discussed in various places within the Millennium Project, and the decision was to do a major multi-year project to look more seriously at the future of work. And certainly there have been many other people studying the future of work, but possibly the view is not sufficiently taking account of the huge transformational potential of technology. So the project started off by looking at the existing literature and deciding that there were areas which were still wide open for discussion. So then it created something called a Delphi, real-time Delphi. This is a technique that's sometimes used in which a whole group of people are asked the same question and they get to see each other's answers, and over the course of time when they reflect on each other's answers, they can change their own answers. And it's done online in real time so that people can benefit, in principle, from this collective intelligence. And so the Millennium Project has run this real-time Delphi, and I'm now going to share some of the results of that. And it will lead on to roadmaps and the creation of scenarios. And I'll pause on this word scenario because it is one of the key topics of futurism. The idea that we should elaborate a possible future in some depth, not just so that we can quickly criticize it and discuss it, but we make it plausible. We try and say, well, if this is going to happen, how will it have come about? What will the possible chains of cause and effect have been? What will the social implications be? What will the human implications be? What will the political and legislative implications be? And we flesh it out, not because we think this is definitely how things will be, but so that it's worthy of a proper discussion. So the project's at the stage when it's starting to flesh out some of the scenarios, and it will lead on to getting more feedback as to the credibility and desirability of these various analyses. There'll be various national groups doing work as well, and I am here to tell you that there will be a group in Britain which will be looking at this in more detail, and over time we will share the results of these planning workshops and announce them. It's called the 2025 study, not because we want to announce the results in 2025, that would be a bit too slow, but because it's our view that by 2025 this will be such a burning issue and that politicians will be desperately looking for good information by this time. And so the idea is over the next 18 months or so, we will make a significant progress in this one area, and that will help to change the political debate well before 2025. So as I said, there's been this real-time Delphi, in which there's been 300 people actively responding, which I was one, plus 100 so-called tourists, which are people who log in and just watch what others are doing. We don't mind a few tourists, but we're grateful for the comments. And as I said, whenever you give an answer in terms of what you think, in terms of a number, the system queries you and says, well, why do you think this? And then you see what other people have said as well. Various people have taken part. Most of them describe themselves as futurists, as well as some other employment, such as an engineer or a futurist and a manager or a futurist and the social scientists. We're quite pleased with this spread. Certainly we want to involve more people. We think a wider set of insight will help to give a fuller picture. And briefly, some of the results. The view is, if we average what all of these participants said, that the unemployment percentage across the developed world is likely to increase. And you can measure this in various ways, and people argue about the right way to measure who's working and who's not working, but it seems likely to at least double and possibly more than double over the next 25, 30 years. And what's even more interesting, if you break down the results in terms of the people who've been working in futurism for a longer period of time, they consider themselves to be more experienced, they are actually more pessimistic, or they see the likelihood of even more unemployment taking place over that time scales. And I count myself in that field too. And the reason why they think this unemployment, other things being equal, is likely to grow is because there are multiple technologies, each changing the way the workforce works. Not just artificial intelligence and robotics, but all of these other fields which are listed on there. And the hardest thing to anticipate is, if you like, the integration, the synergies between these different technologies. And that is what we as futurists are trying to do. If you look at, for example, the latest iPhone, what's in there is not just phone technology, it's a whole bunch of incredible technologies, including camera technology, gaming technology, music, and so forth. It's integration of these things that have made this device the enormous economic consequence and financial success. So in the same way, we have to look at the various technologies which may or may not flourish in that time period, but which in each case is quite likely to do so, and how these merge together, how these impact each other is the thing that's difficult to anticipate, but which is likely to have consequences for employment. So, for example, if we're interested in the future of 3D printing, we should look not just at 3D printing, but we might think, well, if nanotechnology improves, how is that going to impact 3D printing? If synthetic biology improves, how is that going to impact 3D printing? If augmented reality improves, how is that going to impact 3D printing? And when people think more about this, it's all the more argument for taking the future even more seriously in terms of trying to map out these scenarios. And possibly the biggest disruptive scenario is that of artificial intelligence, which can autonomously write and rewrite its own code via systems of deep learning. We're going to hear about this later on by the fourth speaker, Professor Murray Shanahan, who's going to give his own views as to the future of artificial intelligence. But as there are more sensors around the world picking up information, as this is being fed back, it's likely to accelerate the intelligence and have even bigger impacts, 2050 or even earlier, that are more dramatic than those of the semiconductor Moore's law in terms of the changes. Now, I've more or less finished what I was going to say. I will just indicate that the survey asked people, not just here are questions, but asked them, well, what do you think remains to be worked out? And there's a whole bunch of good questions that emerged in terms of, well, do we actually want jobs? Wouldn't it be better to fight to eliminate jobs rather than fighting to retain jobs? And so on. How will the tax evolve in this? I'm not going to go through all of these now, but I will summarize some generalizations which came out of that survey before we break for a short period of questions and answers. So the first thing is that there was no consensus in there as to how this set of challenges should be addressed. People have got lots of ideas, but there's nothing like a consensus emerged as to the best approach. So this is indicating that there's still lots of room for analysis, discussion. And although people understand that artificial intelligence and robots might change the workforce, the other technologies, such as synthetic biology, that's when we create new forms of life, not just new forms of matter, but new forms of bacteria, new forms of genetic engineering, which could strengthen individuals, could be involved in giving us much greater health than before. There's little understanding of how that's going to impact work. And the next speaker after me, Professor Stephen Minger, is going to give some insight into the future of some parts of synthetic biology and stem cells. But on the whole, this is very much of a black area in terms of how it's going to impact. Most people understand that the world economic situations are likely to change. It's not just left-wing politicians who are saying this. Many people on the libertarian or right wing are seeing that the existing structures are going to be put under real stress by the potential growing numbers of people who've been well trained and well educated but don't get the jobs they expected because it turns out that robots have improved much faster and AI has improved much faster and they have the jobs instead. And so people do come to the notion of, well, we have to augment what's known as the income that's received by unemployed people. We should have some kind of basic income in which everybody receives enough to be quite well off, regardless of whether they're working. Seems at first like a daft idea, and you may imagine, well, this is stupid. It's going to take away incentive for people working. But when you think about it more, there are some credibility to it. But the biggest issue is that nobody's got a clear idea how this is going to be paid for. And I do reflect that one of the politicians in Britain who dared to advance such a scheme before the last election, Natalie Bennett, the leader of the Green Party, was found in an interview with Andrew Neil to have no answers as to how this is going to be paid for, and the whole issue looked quite awkward. On the other hand, let's be clear that the generalization shows that most of the respondents do envisage the possibility for a better future for humanity, an end to the tyranny of jobs to earn a living, and a flourishing of the pleasure of meaningful work. This is a different kind of future that lies ahead. It's just not clear how we get there, and it's likely to be irregular around the world. In terms of people being asked, do you think guaranteed lifetime income, is it going to be important by 2050? A quarter of them said yes, absolutely necessary. Another quarter said very important. Another quarter, another half, in fact, we're not so sure. So lots of room to discuss. And as I said, the class for projection to cover that Well, there's various forms of taxation that people discuss. Each form of taxation, of course, has its own drawbacks, possible disincentives, possible disruption to an economy that's otherwise working well. There are some opportunities to improve how the existing welfare programs are paid. With so many different payments, it's quite an admin-heavy system. If we switch to guaranteed income, there are at least some savings there. And there are lots of other factors that are being considered. All I will say is this is to be continued. And you have an opportunity, if you wish, to be part of this project, amongst others. And if you are interested in being part of working out the future of work and how technology impacts, either as a contributor, as somebody who will be involved in figuring out the scenarios, or possibly as a financial backer, then by all means, do get in touch. For further information about the Millennium Project, well, look at millennium-project.org or stateofthefuture.org. That last one has no spaces and no hyphens. And for other things that we are doing in London Futurists, trying more generally to elevate the discussion about the topics that you'll hear about today, so that there's a more serious discussion of these scenarios rather than people just bursting out in fits of laughter out of embarrassment and some of the topics, taking them a bit more carefully, then by all means look at londonfuturist.com, which will lead you to a meetup site. And having said that, I've left a few minutes for some initial questions on that opening remarks before we dive into some more detailed views on some of the areas. Thank you very much.
Any?
There's a question way over
typically
there.
way
Yes.
over there.
Hi, Phil McCauley from Element Partnership. I thought that was really interesting. Thank you for that. I was just wondering whether or not you think everything you've said has implications for the imminent emergence of global political parties and global currencies outside of the banking system.
I think indeed the need for better decision-making systems, the need for new economics, is not being handled well with the existing set of international governance. The United Nations, the World Bank, IMF, they're all set up in the years after the Second World War with a particular set of challenges in mind, including reducing international conflicts. And by some measures, they've done that quite well, but they are not particularly well suited to handling the issues that are being raised. We have to thank the United Nations University for creating some of the bodies that are doing this research, but it does look like these existing bodies are not fit for purpose for this new system. So one option is to try and evolve them, but you know, anybody who's worked in business knows the biggest enemy is inertia. Organizations, companies do things very well for a long time, and that makes them successful, and then when time comes to do it differently, it's very hard to change their DNA. So it is very hard for these existing international governance bodies to migrate. So it may well be that new bodies, informal bodies at first, will emerge and will strengthen and will grow. Some of them might be corporates. Some of the companies that are playing leading roles in this technology, they're already in some sense helping to debate and adjudicate. So Google, love them, hate them, they are setting in place an ethics advisory board for how their artificial intelligence will be used. So some of it may come from corporations, some of it may come from the new kinds of bodies that you'll hear about. So later on you'll hear Anders Sandberg from the Future of Humanity Institute in Oxford, who's given a lot of thought into new governance structures. So I think that it's wide open, and we're going to need some innovation there, as well as innovation just in the technology sectors.
Can I ask a question, David? Just on Telenations, obviously, I'd be quite interested to hear what's all that, what's it about, what's it mean, what's the vision there? If you could just expand on that aspect.
So Telenations was one of the integrated ideas, and the idea is that many people from, say, African countries or Eastern European countries or wherever they go abroad, they develop their businesses in, say, America or Western Europe or wherever, but they still have some sense of loyalty to the nation they left. And rather than just returning there, they can be involved in online communities in which they are discussing from wherever they may be, with people who are left behind in their countries, as to what's the best way that their countries can evolve. So we already know that most of these countries benefit more from a return of money from people abroad than from foreign direct investment in philanthropic. So they're already getting lots of money from people who have left their countries and then afterwards feeding it back to their home. But the idea here is that they will feed back ideas and insights as well as just feeding back money. And then this may emerge further.
Okay, thank you. Any? Okay.
Tim Pendry. I just was looking at the list of people who are contributing. There's one group I didn't see, and yet what you were talking about was about work, and that was trades unions. And I would have thought the policy departments, the political officers of the trades unions, might be very interesting to talk to, if only because they may not only have insights into the nature of work, but also be a political force for raising some of these issues and testing them in the market.
So indeed, the trade union movement does have people who are clued up and attuned to these transformations. We might mention Paul Mason at this stage, the left-wing journalist who has been doing such very interesting reporting from Greece and elsewhere. His new book, I think it's called Post-Capitalism, takes a lot of insight from his contacts within the trade unions and otherwise, and says, you know, there is a need for a new economics, which he calls post-capitalism, in which some of the traditional assumptions are no longer the case. The assumption being that we find our greatest fulfillment, our greatest meaning, our greatest definition through our work. This may no longer be the case. And so there are people on the left, people in trade unions, who've got useful things to say on this, and indeed we will look to involve them more. I should also mention briefly the RSA in the UK has got a similar short project on the future of work, and they're looking at basic income too, and they're waiting for their report sometime in the next month or so. So that's another group that's looking at this. I'm still not convinced that any of these groups are really getting their heads around the potential major changes that technology are going to bring. People think it's going to be a bit of an impact, but they don't see quite how disruptive it's going to be.
Are you, and if not you, who, doing some of the work on the softer aspects, such as the development of human potential, social potential, and looking at it from the point of view of the development of society, which could possibly make the question of unemployment less important?
So indeed, there are these soft skill issues, and because of this projection system's not one I'm used to, I'm not sure how to go back on slides, but one of them did talk about the importance of giving more voice to some of these soft skills, more voice to ethics, but also more voice to the more strength to the female side of life in terms of making sure that the voice of women could be represented. And there are some of these 15 grand challenges looking at exactly that point. So I think we cannot solve this just by technology. I echo the words of the famous management consultant Peter Drucker, who said that the biggest questions to do with technology aren't technical questions at all, they're human questions. And unless we get the human questions to the fore, we're not going to succeed. I think it's time to move on. There will be further discussions at the end when we're going to bring all the panelists back. But I think there'll be a richer discussion once you have a chance to hear what some of the next speakers have got to say.